Hey Ben, Mr. Shapiro, how's it going? My name's Noah. I'm a senior here. I'm probably one of the few people in here who isn't a political science or international affairs major. I'm actually an aerospace engineer, so I know it's
Wow,
kinda...
you're a useful person. Good for you.
They're all useful too.
We from the poli-sci field salute you.
Exactly, thank you, appreciate it. With that being said, I sort of see myself as being somewhat confrontational and maybe having some controversial opinions. So even amongst the engineering school, I tend to get into a lot of arguments or conversations with a lot of people who are on the left side of the aisle. And I personally view that a lot of them don't necessarily argue with logic. They kind of ignore a lot of facts and whatnot. And even when I actively cite some of your arguments and points in my conversations with them, they sort of blatantly ignore them and just sort of appeal to their emotions and whatnot. So how would you suggest I would go about having a productive conversation with someone who is on the opposite political affiliation as me?
I mean, you first have to decide whether the conversation is worth it. I mean, this is, I think, true, by the way, in virtually all areas of life. So to take an example, you have to know what the purpose of a conversation, any conversation you have to know the purpose of it. So I have this policy, my wife and I have this policy. So if you have a wife or a girlfriend, you will know that very often when your wife or girlfriend is asking you about something going on in her life, she doesn't actually want a solution to the thing that's going on in her life. What she actually wants is sympathy as to what's going on in her life. So this was becoming an issue. My wife would come home and she'd tell me a problem, and I'd say, right, here's how you solve it, A, B, and C. And she'd get very angry at me. She'd be very upset. Why aren't you listening? I said, I am listening. I just gave you a solution. And so we came up with a solution, and the solution was that whenever she'd tell me a problem, I'd say, is this a solutions, question, or is this a sympathy question? So I know which mode to use, because I'm not really a human. And then... But at least now I know the purpose of the conversation. Now, when it comes to political conversation, the same thing is true. So you have to determine whether the person you're talking to actually wants to have an honest conversation. You have to determine whether the point of the conversation is to do it in public because you're trying to convince an audience. You have to determine whether the point of the conversation is to sharpen your own skills, maybe sharpen your own arguments, maybe you learn something. Like, I'll be frank, that conversation that we had earlier about healthcare, I'm gonna go home tonight, I'm gonna look up a bunch of French healthcare statistics and see what's true and what's not and how I feel about all that stuff, because I'm not an expert on the French healthcare system, so thank you for that. That's a good conversation. You have to determine what these conversations are about in the first place, and then you act accordingly. And if you have to have a conversation with somebody and the person starts using kind of bully tactics by suggesting that you are a bad person or mean or racist or anything, then you have to say, well, if you have no evidence of that, that makes you a bad person, so we can either cut the conversation off because you're a bad person, or you can stop being a bad person and we can have a normal conversation. Thanks.